At dawn on June the 17th, 1982, Police Constable David Haig was delivering a summons to a poacher. It was the last thing he did. It should have been someone else in that car. It was Mick Clipston's patch. He was sent out to find his colleague and friend, David Haig.
Coming down Norwood Edge, I could see a police car, and it was stationary. The doors were open. When I got nearer, I could see that somebody was laid at the side of the police car. When I looked at him, there was a hole right in the middle of his forehead, and he was dead.
The poacher was soon discounted. So now it was an investigation into the brutal killing of a policeman, a murder with no apparent motive. It was day one in a 17-day reign of terror by a ruthless gunman who was able to outwit the police at every turn. It became the biggest armed manhunt in British police history. Found under the murdered policeman's body was his clipboard. On it he had written a name, a date of birth and a car registration number. Constable Haig may have recorded the clues that would catch his own killer. But the name was false. The car was traceable. It was a green Citroën bought 5 months before in London. On day 3, they found the car abandoned in a field 25 miles away from the Haig murder. There were no fingerprints, no traces, no clues, and the news from London was no help. The buyer had used a bogus name. The trail was cold. They just had to wait for something to happen. The gunman was waiting too, and watching. He was watching this house deep in Lincolnshire's Lawton Forest, checking that the elderly woman inside was alone. The killer broke in and held Vida Jackson prisoner. He stole a few pounds and some food. He said he was sorry, and he left her unharmed. He wore a blue balaclava. She never saw his face. On day 5, and another 20 miles away, the killer found what he wanted, here. Sylvia and George Luckett were at home when the gunman broke in. He tied them up. Later, they tried to escape and threaten him with George's rifle. The killer shot them both in the head and escaped in the couple's brown Rover. He'd got what he came for, a car. George Luckett died instantly, but Sylvia, though badly wounded, crawled to the house next door to raise the alarm. It took her all night.
She was in a very, very distressed state. She looked dreadful. She had nothing at all on her feet, nothing at all. Her trousers and her blouse was just wringing wet through, and of course she was covered in blood. She just looked horrific. We thought she was going to die on us. I mean, although I'd never met this person that had done this terrible thing, but you could feel him around you. You'd sort of walk out of the back door and you could feel his presence. I think you'd go to bed at night hoping that you'd have a dream and you'd wake up and everything would be fine, but of course that didn't happen. It terrified me, absolutely terrified me, for a long time.
Miraculously, Mrs. Luckett regained consciousness and was able to attend her husband's funeral. She has never fully recovered, and to this day she remembers nothing. Despite 2 murders, the police were no nearer the killer. Once again, their only clue was a car. They had to stop the most dangerous man in Britain before he killed again. He was stopped in the Dalby Forest, high on the North York moors, by Ken Oliver. Ken was a police dog handler with 14 years' service. But what happened next was to change his life forever.
I went to the rear of the car. I even called him sir. I said, "Excuse me, sir," I said, "out the car, routine check." Nothing, absolutely nothing. He never even looked at me, he just stared straight forward. And I said, "I don't tell anybody twice," I said, "out the car now." As he picked up the gun, he just stared at me. And I knew for a fact then he was going for my head. He was a head man. And he shot me across my nose. And that hurt. And my young dog came out and he shot him twice, which just gave me enough room to start and run. And I felt this pain under my arm when he hit me. And then thud, thud, somewhere in my back. I've no idea where that was. And I got up to this holiday cottage where there was 2 little girls playing with their granddad. I was shouting, I was a policeman, I'd been shot, and I just gathered the kids up. I've got it very vivid now. I thought he'd follow me through the door, and I just had to get the kids out of the way. I thought he would, if he took me out, he would take the kids out as well. I was convinced this man was on a mission. It just terrifies me. And I've remained terrified ever since. Oh, I wish it never happened. But it did happen, so I'm stuck with it. It drove me to drink harder. It's the only way I can sleep. It caused me to leave the job that I loved. It's just a living nightmare. He just ruined my life totally.
On that day, the double killer drove off into the forest. He had got away again. First on the scene was a forest warden, Mick Hoban, who had seen a pall of smoke on the hillside. Hoban raised the alarm, and police with dogs arrived from nearby Scarborough. They found the getaway car burnt out. The killer was covering his tracks, destroying evidence. He was on foot, and not far away. To warn the killer they were armed, they fired over the car.
He was touching his face and showing me the...
That day, Mick Hoban linked up with a detective, Jim Kilmartin.
My impressions were that A was a terrorist that was about to do a spectacular on the mainland, and police being his target.
The killer was just ahead of them in the forest, and they still had no idea who he was.
When we entered the woods, it became obvious within a very short distance to me that A was a man who knew what he was doing in the wilderness. The way he was moving, he was taking quite a bit of time to go around trees to try and hide and things like that. So he wasn't a man who was fleeing quickly.
We had to pull out and wait for the specialist armed response squad to arrive from York. The journey time from York to this part of the forest is about 3/4 of an hour, but there were several hours in arriving, which was critical on the night.
You could have trodden on this man, and that would have been the first you'd have known about it, you know, when he shot you.
To sort of where he might...
I did think at that time, and I still think, that he certainly knew we were there. but he'd really become the phantom of the forest. He was in his environment. This was the place he liked, and we were the strangers here. And so he took advantage of that for that night.
From dawn on day 8, a huge search was mounted. Marksmen were posted along the forest roads, and 1,000 police drafted in to beat through the area. But on the first day, they found no sign of him. Who was the phantom? They found an answer, not in the forest, but 50 miles away. Constable Martin Hatton was working late in the Leeds Warrants Office on the only clues they had, a dead policeman's clipboard and a date of birth.
Everybody lies about his name, but you don't lie about your date of birth. Because if you are being interviewed later and later and later, you will have to give your date of birth. And what's easier than the truth? Now, the system holds 4,000 to 5,000 current warrants of people wanted at the time. So I decided to go through the system looking for the date of birth. A couple of hours later, under Edwards was a Barry Edwards wanted for an offence of wounding. I had a gut feeling at that time that this is the man. I immediately informed the incident room, and within the hour the flat that Barry Edwards had occupied at that time was searched, and paraphernalia in that flat showed that his proper name was Barry Prudom.
Barry Prudom was well known to the police in Leeds for a string of petty offences. He was a keep-fit fanatic, obsessed with weapons and the military. From inquiries, a picture emerged of a man at the end of his tether. His marriage had broken up. He was now in debt. On this street, Prudom, in a fit of anger, had attacked a driver with a tyre iron. He was facing a serious assault charge. But the police could find nothing that would give him a motive for killing, especially policemen. But if Prudom was the phantom, they did get one clue on how to find him in the forest. At his last address, there was a manual on techniques for survival. No Need to Die was signed for Prudom by its author, Eddie McGee. They knew how to find him. Eddie McGee, a former paratrooper, is an experienced tracker. At the time, he was running an adventure school in Yorkshire, and Barry Prudom had attended one of his courses. If Prudom was the killer, here was the man to find him.
Prudom was very much a loner, very much a loner. But he was determined to get into the army, and this has never been mentioned before, but I simply remember him saying he wanted to get into the American army. Don't ask me why, but he did. But he learnt his skills, he learnt everything from me. So he was taught how to use water properly, how to set traps, how to cook animals, you know, rabbits, fish, stuff like that, and how to build shelters. Providing he did everything that he was shown, he should have had no problem in the forest. He could have stayed there for weeks and months.
For a man trained in survival techniques, Dalby Forest is 50 square miles of perfect cover. If Prudom was the phantom, he could be anywhere in there, watching the search, planning his next move.
In the army they use a system called a tornado and the hurricane system. The hurricane, it's just like a driving force, you just go straight through whatever it is you're attacking and carry on and go through. Well, he was taught to always tornado, to stay in one area, because it confuses the enemy then, you see. When you're there, they're going out searching in all directions and you're right on them.
The hunters soon realized that the gunman could survive and evade. At the time, people lived in fear of an unknown and unseen killer, a nameless and faceless terror. For the only man who could recognize him was Ken Oliver, still in shock and in a safe house.
I was convinced at that time that this man was looking for me because I was the only living witness.
After a further delay of 2 days, Ken Oliver was shown the mugshot.
The eyes. That's just the way he looked at me. Just callous. An evil, evil man. I've been living with that for 19 years.
Barry Prudom. After 10 days, the Phantom had a name. The investigation was over. It was now a manhunt. Prudom had vanished from the forest. He was hungry and desperate, but he was not going to give himself up. In fact, he was going shopping. He walked down the road unchallenged right into the centre of Old Malton. On day 12, the hunted once again turned hunter. Sergeant David Winter was on routine patrol in the town. With him was Constable Mick Wood from Traffic Division.
He said he was going to have a word with a chap, and he pointed down the road to what looked like a little old man with a thumbstick. And I said to Dave, right, I'll join you, and started to walk back to my car. Dave drove off down the road, and as I got back into my car and I looked back, I saw Sergeant Winter crouching down by the side of the police car, and immediately then ran across the road. This chap, who he'd obviously gone to speak to, pursued him across the road, and I saw in his hand what looked like a small black automatic firearm. They disappeared behind the cottages. I heard a shot, just the one shot. I got out of the car. I could see just at the other side of the wall, Sergeant Winter's body was laid in the grass. I just dropped to my knees and got hold of him and tried to ascertain whether he was dead or not. Yes, he was dead. Yeah, he was dead.
At 2:30 p.m. today, Sergeant David Winter of Malton Police, he was shot and fatally injured by a man who escaped into Malton. A search is now underway in Malton, where armed police are warning the public about the risks of facing this man, who is very dangerous.
Prudom had killed just 200 yards from the police station. This was the best chance yet to catch the killer. He could not escape across the river. It was in flood, and he was in the open. He saw what he needed, cover. There was a wood. Prudom followed it along the line of an old railway track. There would be a bridge. But it was a dead end. He doubled back, using the trees as cover. He ran into an old railway cutting to wasteland just behind Malton's tennis club. He disappeared once again. Chief Constable Ken Henshaw had to quell the rising panic.
The murder of David Winter was a real shock. Everybody was devastated. Here we'd got another officer shot in the performance of his duty. It brought it home to people, the real danger that everybody was in, everybody who was in uniform. This man shot to kill. He shot to hit people in the head.
On day 12, Henshaw ordered up the largest arsenal of weapons ever issued to a British police force and threw a cordon round Malton, sealing off the town.
This was a situation which had never occurred before in the history of the British Police Service. There'd never been a manhunt on this particular scale. And there'd never been a situation where we were looking for an armed man who didn't hesitate to shoot to kill and who was skilled in the art of evasion. We were making the rules up as we went along, the rules of the game.
On the front line of the police operation was Jim Kilmartin.
He was here, he'd killed again. We knew he was in the area. We just took up the best positions, overlooking the fields, overlooking where we could possibly see him before he could see us.
Barry England was leading one of the armed units.
Any citizen who reported seeing anyone at all suspicious looking, they were ringing it in. And everything that came in was passed to us. We immediately attended to it. We searched shops, we searched empty premises, we patrolled the main streets, and there were several incidents reported. But understandably, the local people were very worried and very panicky.
A shot rang out, and the press cowered as hundreds of police reached for their guns. A policeman had been wounded, the head of North Yorkshire's firearms unit, Barry England's boss.
The bullet went straight through the roof of the patrol car. Inspector Chelton received the blast down the side of his face, which covered him in blood because the blast would be enough to cause some damage.
Well, I made my way over to the road and found out that in actual fact it wasn't the suspect that had fired the shot, that it had been an accidental discharge of a police firearm in a vehicle.
All the journalists who were gathered around the police station suddenly hit the deck because they thought the police station may well be under fire, or they were.
They got some really good footage of reporters taking shelter against this, you know, what they thought was a gun battle going on. In actual fact, there was only the one shot.
At the time, the chief constable let people believe that the shot came from Prudom.
I didn't tell the press. I didn't really want to embarrass the officer any further. He was sufficiently embarrassed as a consequence of an accidental discharge of a firearm.
But the town was in the grip of fear. The armed gunman was close by. The Phantom was free to kill again.
We honestly didn't know where he'd gone. But unfortunately, there had been a torrential downpour just after the shooting. And when the dogs got there, of course, the scent had all been washed away. So it evaded us yet again. Luck was on his side, and it was against us.
The chief constable was running out of options. There was talk of the army being sent in. Then, something happened which changed the course of the manhunt. A volunteer arrived at police headquarters.
I said, what sort of a chap was he? And he said, he says that he's a tracker. And that was Eddie McGee. He said he's a bit of a nutcase, I think, really. He came with what he considered to be a survival kit in a matchbox. He said he can follow tracks and bent grass and twigs and dew and cobwebs and things of that sort. And so I said, what did you do with him? He said, oh, I sent him on his way. So I said, well, I want to see him. And I want to see him straight away. I
didn't realise that they'd sent a helicopter for him.
The manhunt was about to become a battle of wits between a tracker and his pupil. "13 days after the search for the Phantom began, with the killing of Constable Haig, Eddie McGee was finally airlifted to Malton to track down the elusive killer.
Well, when I arrived, they knew very little about Barry Prudom at all. I told them more about him than they knew. The problem then was to convince the policeman that this bloke wasn't an idiot in front of us. And unless we started to treat him like he was treating us, we would never catch him.
Now that we have the services of this expert, I am very optimistic.
But Henshaw was taking an enormous risk. It was the first time a police force had used a tracker in this way, and it was opposed by many of his senior officers. On the front line of the manhunt was McGee, with massive armed support on the ground.
I was pointing out where we just got the last sighting, and I was telling the skipper to go down and what to do. And we flew around and I was telling him what to look for. Going round about 5 or 6 times, watching for the birds moving out. But we got another call to go somewhere else. So we were more or less up and down.
The day Eddie arrived, Prudom was seen 2 miles from Malton at John Sturdy's farm.
Well, that's my daughter's bedroom window up there. She was 9 years old at the time, and she was looking out of the window at the police helicopters buzzing around. And she said she saw this figure run across the road, jump a ditch, run through a hedge. And so we thought we'd better telephone the local police, which we did do. A lot of armed police came down every day for several days then. They searched all the farm buildings, the fields, the woodlands, roundabout. They went into the farm buildings with their guns drawn. The police told us to keep our shotguns loaded and to use it if necessary. This man was very, very dangerous, and we were to take no chances whatsoever.
It would appear to be a hoax call. There's nothing here. 7-2.
The police radio had been on at home and in the office all the time. It was the only way of knowing what was going on. He might have been here, he might have been gone. We'd absolutely no idea. They'd get 50 reports a day that he'd been sighted somewhere or other. So there was this phony war atmosphere where this man was the centre of people's attention, but he was nowhere to be found. I don't think anybody knew what to do. I don't know how much brain was actually applied to what was going on. There was this sense of people rushing around like chickens with no heads.
139 incidents reported and investigated yesterday, none of them with any success. We have not yet caught this man. We are continuing our searches today. We have upwards of 800 police officers involved in those searches, and we will have used policemen from 10 different forces.
People did realise that the police had to use every means. This tracker was just one that they used. But the local people did, I think, seem to think that it was a little bit of a joke, and that it wasn't taken really seriously.
Mr. McGee became known as Mr. Magoo from the cartoon character. This chap was sort of arrived in the helicopter, like something out of Vietnam, and he'd look around where a goat appeared to have been milked recently, and it had been reported as a possible place where Prudom might have been. And he'd say, oh yes, this man was here 10 minutes ago, blah, blah, blah. It was a shambles, but, you know, they did what they thought they were best doing.
On day 15, Chief Constable Henshaw announced to the press that at last the killer was trapped. A positive sighting led Eddie McGee and Barry England 3 miles down the railway line from Moulton to the village of Hutton's Ambo.
Everybody wanted to be there, so when we did arrive, there might be 60, 70 officers plus the press, all walking about, so it became physically impossible to try and identify him and say, yes, he has been here, and he hasn't. I kept telling the police, but they wouldn't listen, that we should stay within the area. He'd been taught to stay low, and he wouldn't be wandering all over the place. Like, unfortunately, the police have to act on all the sightings, so whenever we got these sightings, we went.
Well, you've got to respond to every call if you want to keep the public's confidence. We were looking for him from dawn till dusk, and we expected him behind every tree that we looked around. We expected him in every farm building we searched, and still the pressure was still on.
But the police, mystified, never found Prudom at Hutton's Ambo.
He must have had maps, because he seemed to be able to move to different places without hindrance. And there were some sightings of him having a pack with like an aerial in the back, which he may have had a radio. He also seemed to be able to get along in like 4-day spells. He was assuming that after 3 days, police interest would be dropping, and that the resources would be moved away, and that, you know, everyone would presume that he'd left the area. What kept coming into our minds was that every 4 days, something nasty happened.
The killer seemed to have vanished. Police, helicopters and Tracker McGee were chasing shadows. But Kilmartin was right. Prudom was about to make a new move. Eddie was billeted in a police cell, trying to second-guess his pupil.
And I said, he's right under your noses. And they kept saying, no, he's gone to York. I said, no, he hasn't. He's been told to stay put. He's tornadoed. He's right here, waiting. When you get tired, he'll walk out.
In fact, Prudom was just 100 yards away from the police station. For 3 days he lay here in a hide behind the tennis club as the search continued round him. But hunger forced him into the open. Behind a nearby house, he found a shed, its door unlocked. Inside was a ready supply of food, cat food. On the 4th day, he made a desperate move. He broke cover and walked into the house. The triple murderer was to kill again. Maurice Johnson, a retired decorator, was at home with his wife, Bessie. Their son, Brian, was at the family allotment. When Bessie went into her dining room, she was confronted by Prudom and his gun.
He pointed at me and said, you know who I am? And I said, well, no, I don't. You see, as calm as that. And, you know, I don't know, it's funny now, I can laugh, but I thought that it was a kid having a prank, you know, because his eyes are not old. It's not a bit like the picture.
And I came in at 6:30 into the kitchen. I came in that night and I was carrying a bucket of eggs. I'd collected about 6 dozen eggs. And I was about to put them down and I looked across over the table and there was a gun pointing at me and I realised who it was then. And I ran through there and shouted at my mother and father, and he came through to me and he said, you did right to run that way. He said, because if you'd gone that way, he said, I'd have put a bullet in the back of your head.
On that chair and went upstairs.
The killer bound the 3 of them hand and foot and forced them to lie on the floor.
And when he came back in again, my father asked if he could sit up in the chair, and he let him, and then my mother sat up there and he asked me if I wanted to sit down, so I came down and sat down here. and he tied the he took the bailer band from behind my back and tied my hands in front of me. And then he knelt down there at the back of a buffet and put the gun on the buffet. And he went up to the toilet several times, and one time he left the gun there. And we all looked at each other and shook our heads, you know, don't touch it, sort of thing. And he went halfway upstairs and then came back in again to see if we'd touched the gun, you know, and then he saw that we weren't going to bother, so he went upstairs and left it there, you know. As the night went on, we sort of got talking as though we'd known each other for years. He was calling me Brian, and my father, he was calling him Dad.
Former Sergeant Major in the Parachute Regiment, Mr. McGee is a highly trained tracker.
That night, Prudom insisted on them all watching the television news. It was the day Eddie McGee was tracking him at Hutton's Ambo.
Thick undergrowth and difficult woodland, but the police say he's having...
What they showed on the news, I mean, it was a load of rubbish. He'd never been at Hutton's Ambo at all. He said Eddie McGee couldn't track him. He said, but he could track Eddie McGee. And my dad kept saying to him, give yourself up, Barry. He said, if you ring the police up, he says, they'll come in here and they'll shoot us all. God. Anyhow, eventually, he decided to go.
Before he left, Prudom gave Brian a present.
United States paratroopers ring. He said I had to have it. He said, promise me that you'll wear it. And I said, yes, I will. Don't know what else could I have done. He wanted some sandwiches to eat, so my mother made him some more sandwiches. He said, this will be the last supper. So obviously he knew he was going to die, he knew he wasn't going to go anywhere. He shook hands with us all and said, thank you very much for everything. It's nice to meet nice people. I didn't know there were such nice people about. And then he just disappeared into the night. And that was it, which was about 3 o'clock then in the morning.
Shortly after 5 a.m. this morning, a telephone call was received at Malton Police Station from a Mr. Morris Johnson.
It was day 17. Helicopters were scrambled and mobile patrols fanned out around Malton. The police had to catch Prudom before he could escape again.
If he comes out and surrenders and throws away his weapon, then he will not be killed. That is not the way that the British police force work. We want to take him alive, if at all possible. I was hoping, of course, that if they did find him, that he would perhaps surrender, having seen the strength of the officers that were opposing him. But it was always at the back of my mind that that strategy might come unstuck, and we could lose some more policemen. And again, officers attended straight away, and police dogs attended. And again, the dogs failed to find him. I can't explain as to why it was. It was a complete mystery to me.
The dogs led officers the wrong way. They never found him. Eddie McGee had been held back by senior officers. After 2 hours, he convinced the chief constable to let him track the killer directly from the back of the Johnsons' house.
It was obvious that somebody had been through because you could see the disturbed marks all the way through. And it was fairly early in the morning, and there was plenty of dew around, so the marks were very clear as we went along. When I got to about here, it was easy to see, look, where you can see the mark on the tree where the branch was broken, where somebody had gone through, pushing the branch to one side and snapped it off. It was just a case of following him through here, or following whoever had gone through here, and very, very slowly going forward, because I've no idea where he was at this time, and he could have quite easily been sitting in the corner staring straight at me. It was fairly misty, it was wet, and just like you can see here, there was a definite footprint where the lad had come, Prudom had come to the edge, and you could see quite clearly where he'd gone across on the dew, right across towards that fence thing over there. And I cautioned the two officers at that corner there, and I moved forward very cautiously. As I was looking forward, there was a blue bag and it just shuddered. As I stepped in like that to have a look, his leg came out and it pushed my leg back. And I looked inside like that and I was looking straight into his face. And he was lying prone there, he had the gun across his chest and he had a machete on his side, and I just literally stepped back and I said, "Jim, he's there."
Eddie then did exactly as he'd been instructed to do and moved away. You've got to remember that all this time that he was unarmed, and so, you know, he had no ability to defend himself at all.
I recognised his face, he had his hat pulled down over his eyes like that, and when I saw the bloody gun, you know.
We'd finally tracked this man down. We'd got him. And I ran and round the corner and headed for the end where I thought that this was the only escape route that was available to this guy. So I came to this point at the end of the wall, and then I called out to Barry, really he could do to give himself up now, and to throw out his weapons and come out with his hands up, really. But he never answered at all. He never gave any indication of either wanting to talk or of wanting to surrender, and he made absolutely no movement.
The people of Malton heard on the police radio that at last the killer had been cornered. TV news crews kept their cameras running. In the police station, the chief constable made the decision to hand over command of the operation on the ground.
The report came. Eddie's found him, and we've contained him. We've called on him to come out, he won't come out. And just by sheer chance at that moment, a contingent of 70 officers were arriving from Greater Manchester Police. So I deployed those officers as a perimeter containment force around the area to make sure that no members of the public were likely to get involved if there should be any gunfire. And Chief Inspector David Clarkson of West Yorkshire Police, who was their firearms officer, I put him in charge of the incident.
I went forward with the shield, but then when I come to the wall itself, I can use the wall then to protect myself from whoever's behind the lean-to. The tracker, who I know was Eddie McGee, I'd never met him and still haven't met him. I can only say this, Eddie McGee never saw him. All he saw was a foot. And unless I won't take positive action unless I'm absolutely sure, and I wasn't sure. And I put my shield down, and then I put my gun aside because I wanted to see if I could disturb him and find out who it was. So I climbed up the wall very cautiously, looking down all the time, and then I saw that the light slap fencing, so I tried to move it, but I couldn't get enough leverage because the more I leaned, the more I was exposed. But I spoke to him, and I got no response whatsoever. Then, as I'm doing this, the gun went off, and I fell back. And then I realised that that must be Prudom, because that's his normal reaction. He's not to speak to anybody, he's just to shoot them. And at that time, I'm sure I set fire. We pulled it back and I saw him just laid there under a polythene sheet and with a gun, and his gun was facing up. I'm sure it was something like this.
Police guns fired 17 times. Britain's most wanted criminal was dead.
I thought that I'd caused his death, yes. Who shot him, I wasn't sure, but I thought I had caused his death.
What happened could have been better executed. I thought we'd moved a little too quickly.
Even now, I'm reliving it, and now I'm not happy, because I'm reliving what went on. And even now, I can't forget that day.
It was a great relief when it was over. I was disappointed that it had to end the way that it did. A lot of my officers disagreed with me over this. They were pleased to see that he was dead. They think he deserved to die. And undoubtedly they were right. It was a fitting end, I think.
Yeah, as soon as the shots went off, I knew, I knew they'd got him. I knew that was it. The end. Yeah. Sort of felt sorry because I'd known him. There for revenge filled him full of lead. I think that was what happened. They shouldn't have done that, should they? A bit for revenge.
But even in death, Prudom had cheated the police. The post-mortem found that Prudom had not fired at Chief Inspector Clarkson. He fired into his own head. His last victim was himself. Police marksmen had fired at a dead man. The men he shot were not his only victims. For 17 days, Barry Prudom brought terror wherever he went and left a trail of damaged lives. Chief Constable Henshaw retired soon after the Prudom case, a disappointed man.
I recommended a number of people, both police officers and civilians, for awards for the bravery that they displayed. None of the recommendations were accepted. I was very disappointed. Whether the powers that be felt that we'd been so avant-garde in the way in which we dealt with things, I don't know. I've no idea.
But the police never found Barry Prudom. The tracker did.
But he didn't outwit me, did he? And he wouldn't have outwitted me earlier on if the police had let me do my own thing. But I had to go where the policeman told me to go. So the proof of the pudding is I'm sat here talking to you and he's in a box.